Happy Tech Art Tuesday! Before we start the tutorial, I think it's a good idea to show you what the final result's gonna be. There were too many times I followed the rigging tutorial for like 20 minutes, and then I realized the end result wasn't what I wanted. So here's what we're gonna be building this week. Whoop! This setup has some extra joints and some extra controls if the animator wants to do noodly arms. You can also rotate it. The joints also have diminishing rotate X as they go farther up the arm, and that is true both for the wrist and also for the elbow. I'm going to divide this tutorial into two parts because as I am editing it right now, I realize that it's a lot of information to convey in a single video, and it's also very long. So I'm going to release the first part today, which is what you're watching right now, and the second part is Thursday. In this first video, we are going to be making basically the whole setup. We're going to be making the joints, the IK spline setup. We're going to connect the transform and some rotation of the controls to the joints. The next video, we're going to be doing something a little bit more fancy. We are going to create a node network that adds the rotation X of this control with the rotation X of the wrists, so that the animator can still use this control to rotate in X, but it's not going to override whatever this control is doing. I highly recommend following along with the blog post because I'm going to put up some diagrams of what the node network should look like, because it is kind of a complicated setup, especially if you're not familiar with the node editor. And I'm also aware that it's kind of hard to see the writing on my screen because my monitor is freaking huge. That is something I'm trying to troubleshoot for next videos though. With that being said, here's the tutorial. Hello! Today we're talking about a twist setup. I was going to release this last Thursday, but I shot it pretty late at night, and after I reviewed my recordings I didn't really like how I explained things. I thought I didn't do a good enough job. So I thought it was better to reshoot it and postpone it. And the first thing we're going to do is create the extra joints that we're going to need for the setup. So let's go ahead and go to our skeleton tab and create joints tool and create a new joint. Let's go ahead and call it left upper arm bind joint. And we're going to parent-constrain it to the shoulder joint. Maintain offset off because we want the orientation to match. And then we're going to freeze transforms only on the rotation. So now the joint orientation should be aligned perfectly with the shoulder joint. Before I create the next joints, I want to decide the spacing for my joints in the upper arm. And I think for this setup, I'm gonna do 1, 2, 3, 4. And I want the spacing to be even. So to figure that out, I'm gonna go into my node editor, clean it up. I'm going to create a distance between node. I'm going to load my shoulder joint and my elbow. I'm going to plug the world matrix 0 into the distance between node. If nothing shows up, I just go to display shown on keyboard and then you can see the input. And I'm going to connect it to in matrix 1. And I'm going to do pretty much the same thing on the elbow joint in matrix 2. And I'm going to create a random node just so I can see that value. And I'm going to say it's just a reverse node. Would work. So here's the distance between the shoulder and the elbow. Now, as I said, we're going to have 1, 2, 3, 4 joints, and we're going to have 3 spaces between these joints. So we're going to grab that value we just got, go to our calculator, and divide it by 3. And copy this value Wow, calculator just shut off on me. We're going to duplicate this a few more times to make all of the joints we're gonna need. And I'm gonna call you 0. And 3. I'm gonna parent these to each other to create a chain. And now we can translate them in X by that amount that we got from the calculator. And if we calculate it correctly, that last joint should align almost perfectly to the elbow, which it does. We don't really need this anymore, so let's delete it. So we don't have random nodes floating around in our Maya. And let's parent this to the shoulder joint. The next thing we're gonna do is duplicate the bind chain. We're going to replace the bind part with twist. And this chain is what's gonna hold our IK handle for the spline solver. But first, let me parent constrain the bind to the twist. So let's select the twist first and then the bind. Constrain. I'm only gonna do translate because we're gonna do something different for the rotate. The same for the other ones. Make sure joint orientation is still the same. Nothing got moved or messed up. Now let's select the twist. Go to our skeleton tab, create splineIK handle, reset the tool because the default setting should be good, and make the IK handle from the top to the bottom. It's going to automatically create a curve and we're gonna call it upper arm spline curve. And we're going to unparent it. Now if we isolate the curve and go into control vertex mode, you can see the control vertex that we are going to proceed to cluster. Do the same for all of them. We're also going to rename these clusters because I like to be organized. Okay, now that we have all of this going on, we can go ahead and make some controls for these clusters, because that's how the animator is going to control these joints. And I like to use squares for this because we have too many circles already. Create curve tool, EP curve tool. I'm gonna do this, doop, 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 because last time I checked the square has 4 sides. I'm gonna call this control and duplicate it for the other ones. I think I did one extra, oops. Now I'm going to align these controls to the joints. Parent constrain this guy. Maintain offsets off, rotate on. Do the same for the other ones. A lot of this can be automated because, as you can tell, I'm just redoing a bunch of processes over and over again. Let's rotate them. Make sure your rotate tool is in object space, like so. As I talked about in the previous video, I'm going to use a tool that I quickly wrote just to compensate these automatically. Now let's parent constrain the clusters to these control curves. So this goes to this. Let's only do rotate, because as I said, we're doing something different for the rotate. Now if I move these around, it moves the clusters. But as you can tell, if I move the arm with the FK control that we made in the previous video, these are staying in place, which is bad. So in order to fix that, let's group all of these together and call it left upper arm rig. Let's put it, actually let's put all of this under the extras group. And it's going to group the clusters. But anyway, as I was saying, let's constrain this rig group to the shoulder so that it rotates with the shoulder. Now if I do this, everything follows. Okay, so just so we're in the same page, we just created a splineIK handle, which resulted in a splineIK handle and a spline curve. We created clusters for the control vertex in the curve. We also made control curves for the clusters. So in your extras group, you should have added an IK handle, a curve, however many clusters you made, and a control curve. I'm gonna go ahead and make these green. Enable overrides. So they're a different color from the rest of the control, so they're easier to see. I'm going to hide most of these. Hide. So it's all nice and clean. Now you notice if I move this really far away, the joint kind of detaches from the rest of the arm because the scale doesn't change. And we're gonna fix that by creating a series of mathematical operations through a node network that will change the scale x of these joints depending on how far away the controls are from their original position. Let's start by going into our node editor, clean your workspace. So let's load up our spline curve. And I believe we only need the shape. This guy. And let's create a node called curve info. And then we connect our world space 0 to input curve. We're going to create a few more nodes that are going to be multiply divide. Let's call this left upper arm div. I'm going to duplicate this. Call it left upper arm limb scalar. We're going to set the operation of this multiply divide to divide. We're going to connect the arc length of curve info into input 1x of upper arm div. We're going to grab this value, paste it into input 1 of limb scalar, and connect the output x of limb scalar into input 2x of upper arm div. And I suppose for now you could just copy and paste the arc length into input 2x. But the cool thing about limb scalar is that later, if you want to make your rig scalable, you can make the twist setup scalable as well by connecting the scale of the rig into the input 2x of this node, so that the base arc length of the curve changes with the scale of the rig, and this setup stays consistent with any scale that you have. It's very difficult to explain it. I'm sorry. I'm also not that great at math. JK, actually, I was a math tutor for most of high school. But anyway, now we have what we need, because the output x of this thing is gonna connect into the scale x of the twist joints we made previously. Let's open them up. Scale, 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 scale. Output x. And the reason we're doing scale x is just because of the joint orientation of this chain. If this chain had the primary axis be y, we would connect it to scale y and so on. But this is just what I have on my setup right now. Okay, so do you work? Oh, it works. Yes, yes, yes. I love when things work. Now if you want to be super extra fancy about it, you could also connect the scale y and the scale z to another network of nodes, so that not only it's stretching, it's also shrinking, so it's maintaining the volume. And I think the Autodesk YouTube channel has a tutorial on it, but it's for a spine instead of an arm. But it's basically the same principle. I'm not gonna do it because this is a lot of information already, and also I'm a little bit lazy. It is a Saturday, and here I am making rig tutorials for my blog. Before we move on, I'm going to skin the geometry to the bind joints that we made in the beginning, because I want to be able to see my setup working, so I can tell if there's something wrong or not. After I finished skinning, I realized I was starving, so I went to McDonald's. Okay, where were we? Rotation. Yes. When I first learned this setup, it was translation only, but more recently, I was asked by an animator to make rotation possible. Clean tab, and we're going to grab this control, and that's control 0, so let's get bind joint 0, and let's connect rotate Y to rotate Z, and we're basically going to do the same thing for all of these. Now for rotate X, this is going to make more sense in the wrist, but I like to do it for the upper arm as well. When the elbow joint rotates a little bit in X, we want the rest of the arm to rotate gradually less until it reaches 0 at this joint. So to do that, we're going to open our node editor back up. We're going to get the elbow joint, just the original one, and we are going to grab our last bind joint, and the rotation of this joint is going to be the same as the elbow. Bind joint 2 is going to have a little bit less rotation than bind joint 3. Let's get rid of this guy and put this guy here. Now we have 1, 2, 3 spaces, so it's roughly gonna go down 30%. What is 100 divided by 3? It's like 33 something. Let's get another multiply divide node. We're going to set input 2x to 0.33. We're gonna set it to multiply, which it should be by default. Let's call it left upper arm dim rotate dim. Elbow rotate X to input 1x, and the output X to rotate X. So now, if I rotate this in X a little bit, bind joint 3 should have the same amount as the rotation, which it does, and bind joint 2 should be only a third, and it seems like it is. So next, let's do bind joint 1, and I might just use the same node instead of creating another one. So 0.66, execute order 66. I connected rotate X to input 1Y. Input 2Y has 0.66, and output Y is gonna go into rotate X. That doesn't seem right. Hold on. I told you I'm not good at math. Okay. Now things make sense. So if I rotate the elbow, this one rotates the same amount, this one a little less, and this one even less. And I'm gonna leave this one at 0.